For those who do, this is another one of my books. Don't worry, they're not read. I just put them up there to apprise you of the fact that they were written. It's no problem. I'm used to it. Practicing exile. Most Jews of conscience, I've already talked about Constantinian Jews, right? Jewish establishment. Then we have progressive Jews who think they're in a civil war with the Constantinian establishment, but actually are much more like them than they would like to think. Constantinian Jews argue that Jews are innocent in our suffering and innocent in our empowerment. So everything Israel does is innocent. Progressive Jews say Jews are innocent in our suffering and innocent in Israel, but after the 1967 war, we did some things wrong. We need to correct them so we can return to our innocence. So, for instance, progressive Jews say yes to a Palestinian state and dismantling of the settlements, because that's wrong, but it never really gets down to the basics of which ones, because the settlements around Jerusalem really aren't settlements, they're cities. They're not going anywhere. And progressive Jews are interesting too, because they say Palestinians need to be separate from us. We'll give them a state. It's not really defined what that would be. But it's got to be demilitarized because we have to have our security guaranteed. And of course, that means since they're demilitarized in a world that isn't, they need to be protected. And they'll be protected by the Israeli Defense Forces, according to progressive Jews. And Tikkun, Michael Lerner, I don't know if you've heard of that magazine in the United States, and the editor. And the reason they can be protected by the Israeli Defense Forces, even though they expelled them from Palestine, what became Israel, we'll look at some maps in a moment, and even though they have pushed them further into the West Bank and occupy parts of the West Bank on a permanent basis, the reason why Palestinians can't have an army is they can't be trusted, because maybe Arabs can't be trusted. The reason why the Israeli Defense Forces can protect them is because we can be trusted and because Jews are good. It's sort of the same reason that Israel can have nuclear weapons and Iran can't. Now, I'm not in favor, let me make it clear, I'm not in favor of Iran having nuclear weapons. I'd like there to be no nuclear weapons, but I do find it interesting. The United States can have it. The UK can have it. I asked about Canada. They say, no, you don't have it, but you have ours. So we're just going to say you have them whether you like it or not. So those Jews of conscience, differentiating from progressive Jews and Constantinian Jews, say that Constantinian Jews and progressive Jews are so close together that progressive Jews are really the left wing of Constantinian Judaism, and we need to leave in order to get a perspective that's different, because both Constantinian Jews and progressive Jews hit at Jews of conscience because they're coming closer to the center of the question. Jews of conscience believe that Jews are not innocent in our empowerment, and they go back to 1947 and 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, 700, 800,000, as an original sin. When you get there, and some of the other ideas of Jews of conscience, you're in exile. So a significant part of the Jewish community, including some Jewish Israelis, are in exile. What does that exile mean for the future of Jews and Judaism? And how can we practice our Jewishness in exile? because we're with many other exiles, Christian exiles, Catholic exiles, Muslim exiles, American exiles, exiles from the Philippines, exiles all over the world. We're really a community of exiles, aren't we? What I call the new diaspora, where we have fragmented and almost destroyed particularities that come into exile with other fragmented and almost destroyed particularities. And no one particularity will become a universal, but we're in dialogue with one another. You know, exiles always think they're going home, right? So for 30 years, one exile says to the other, I'm going home, and the other one says, I'm going home too. But you don't go home. So that's our community. My question in practicing exile is, will there be a surviving Jewish particularity in that exile? Now, for some of you, it may not be important. It's okay. It is to me. And I think it is to the broader community, because every one of those particularities is important. Well, if Judaism does equal Israel, as the editorial stated, here's some pictures to think about. This is the fence, the barrier, and the wall, all in the West Bank. I want to just go through some visuals so we know where we are. Now, the fence here is not like the fence that I used to climb over to play baseball. I had a little fence in an elementary school, loved climbing it, because there was baseball on the other side, but this is not that kind of fence. This is a fence that cuts through Palestinian territory, separating Palestinians, towns and fields, and you can see that the land it takes up, these can run for miles. On both sides of the fence, you see the ditches, and of course there's sensory equipment all through to tell Israeli soldiers if there are Palestinians there, right? So when somebody said to me in the beginning, oh, it's just the fence, that's it. When I had a discussion with the ambassador to Boston, I had a lecture with him. He told me not to worry about the wall, it was temporary. If you've seen the wall, it doesn't look temporary. These are olive trees being uprooted. There are hundreds or maybe thousands of olive trees that have been uprooted. It's, of course, land, economy, but also symbols for Palestinians of steadfastness in the land. Remember, in the Holocaust, we can't even wrap our mind around 6 million Jews. It's so many, right? It's unbelievably horrible. But we were also humiliated as a people. And when the Nazis rounded up Jews, they often did it on the Sabbath, on Passover, on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur. They often gathered Jews in synagogues where they had to stay for days. They had to defecate in the synagogue. They used to parade the rabbis, their beards shaven in front of the community. We were humiliated as a people. We weren't just robbed. We weren't just imprisoned. We weren't just killed. We were humiliated as a people. Well, the tower that runs along the wall, I was a little retro. I thought that soldiers would be in these towers. They can be, but they don't have to be. Again, it's equipment that monitors Palestinians, and of course it looks over into where they're living. Of course, we Jews remember ghettos, right? This is another fence that guards a settlers-only road from rocks being thrown and Palestinians using that road. Kakilia, the whole city is surrounded by the wall. Again, if Judaism equals Israel, then show these pictures at the synagogue services as something we should be proud of. Signs. Bethlehem. Peace be with you. Once I attended an Easter Mass. I was working at the Catholic Worker, and it was an Easter Mass. A friend took me to her home in Connecticut for some rest. And the priest talked about the whole time about the blood on the hands of the Jews. And as I walked out, he didn't know I was Jewish. He said, "Peace be with you." Well, I was younger then. He put out his hand to shake it, and I said, "It's bloody. You don't want it." But peace be with you. We remember also signs in places that we were taken that didn't quite say what was going to happen, right? And what happens to the language of Hebrew? And I wrote another, actually it was read a little bit, titled Unholy Alliance, Religion and Atrocity in Our Time. And I quoted from George Steiner, who's a European Jew, who talked about how the German language was polluted forever by the use of the terms that the Nazis used. That in fact the language was now infected with atrocity. Well, there we have peace be with you in Hebrew. What happens to Hebrew, the sacred language, when it's used to torture people? Is Hebrew also infected with atrocity? So the wall, fence, barrier, call it what you want. Security wall, it's in the West Bank. If Israel wants to build a wall on its territory, I don't think it's a good idea, but I wouldn't say anything. President Carter calls it an apartheid wall. From the perspective of Jewish history, we might as well call it a ghetto wall. Now, people ask me, what's going to happen over time within that wall or those walls? I said, I don't know. I don't make predictions. But if you want to read about what happens, read the history of ghettos. And you'll get the possibilities of what might happen over time. Well, here are some maps. Those are some visualizations, if in fact Judaism does equal Israel. Here are some maps also that need to be looked at. Now, my idea about mapping is very simple. In our personal, communal, religious, national lives, we have maps inside. And we tend to show the good maps. And the sign of maturity is to get those maps that we don't want to see and put them out there. It's sort of one way of defining maturity. It's not pretty, but it's honest. Well, this is the map to start out of what is supposed to be the two-state solution, not perfect justice for Palestinians, but we have Israel in green, and in lighter green, the West Bank, part of Jerusalem, and on the left, the Gaza Strip, supposed to be connected by a road or a bridge or a tunnel. And that is the two-state solution. By the way, I'm a two-stater, although we're not going to have two states. We have one state now that goes from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River, and it's controlled by Israel. So that's the internationally recognized solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Now here are some maps of the West Bank. And I'm going to show you Israel in the West Bank. Remember, the West Bank is supposed to be completely free with part of Jerusalem. I'm not even showing you maps of Jerusalem and how that is being Judaized. But this is 1995. Remember the Oslo Accords, 1993, the idea for many, especially progressive Jews, that we were now on the road to peace with some justice. And here is the 1995 map. In dark brown, that goes immediately to Palestinians. The light brown, controlled by Israel and the Palestinians, but will go to the Palestinians. And the lightest brown will remain with Israel. And the triangles, blue, purple, are Jewish settlements. Now notice that all the borders of the West Bank are Israel. And if you take the dark brown and the light brown, you'll see that in between and around is Israel too. Israel permanently in the West Bank. And, of course, controlling it. This is what Jeff Halper, who's been here, has called the matrix of control. What you have is Palestinians in population centers, Israel taking most of the land with the least Palestinians. These are going to get repetitive, but that's the lesson. This is Netanyahu 1. He's returned, right? Do you remember how many progressive Jews told you, or you told yourself, that Sharon could never be elected Prime Minister of Israel because he was too far outside the consensus of Israeli politics, even though he had been in just about every government that Israel had had? He was elected twice. Do you remember Mrs. Rabin inviting Yasser Arafat to her home after her husband was assassinated, but not letting Netanyahu come? Do you remember she said that if people like Netanyahu ran the country, her children or grandchildren would not live in Israel? (2000). Dark brown Palestine, light brown Israel, and around you see the triangles for settlements. See where they are? More or less same map. Progressive Jews who think they're in a civil war with the Constantinian establishment, but actually are much more like them than they would like to think. Constantinian Jews argue that Jews are innocent in our suffering and innocent in our empowerment. So everything Israel does is innocent. Progressive Jews say Jews are innocent in our suffering and innocent in Israel, but after the 1967 war, we did some things wrong. We need to correct them so we can return to our innocence. So, for instance, progressive Jews say yes to a Palestinian state and dismantling of the settlements, because that's wrong, but it never really gets down to the basics of which ones, because the settlements around Jerusalem really aren't settlements, they're cities. They're not going anywhere. And progressive Jews are interesting too because they say, and Tikkun, Michael Lerner, I don't know if you've heard of that magazine in the United States, and the editor. And the reason they can be protected by the Israeli Defense Forces, even though they expelled them from Palestine, what became Israel, we'll look at some maps in a moment, and even though they have pushed them further into the West Bank and occupy parts of the West Bank on a permanent basis, the reason why Palestinians can't have an army is they can't be trusted. Palestinians need to be separate from us. We'll give them a state. It's not really defined what that would be. But it's got to be demilitarized because we have to have our security guaranteed. And of course, that means since they're demilitarized in a world that isn't, they need to be protected. And they'll be protected by the Israeli Defense Forces, according to progressive Jews. For those who do, this is another one of my books. Don't worry, they're not read. I just put them up there to apprise you of the fact that they were written. It's no problem. I'm used to it. Practicing Exile. Most Jews of conscience, I've already talked about Constantinian Jews, right? Jewish establishment. Then we have